The Mighty Miss Malone, Chapter 18. Deza steers on the last days in Gary. If I ever found that Dewey Decimal System for superstitious sayings and looked up bad news comes in threes, I would have seen that for the Malones it meant 3 times every hour. At supper, Jimmy asked what kind of truck we were going to use to move. Mother said, "Children, give me your hands." A not so good sign. "Jimmy, Deza, there isn't going to be a moving truck. We don't need one." My heart flew. "Oh, Mother, I knew it. We aren't moving." "Yes, Deza, we are. We just won't need a truck to do it. Most of this furniture," she looked around. "Who am I kidding? None of this furniture is ours." What? I wouldn't have been more surprised if Mother had told me that after 12 years of being on the end of my leg, my left foot belonged to someone else. "No, dear, we rent this place furnished. Pretty much all of this belongs to the landlord." I was shocked and mortified. The first thing that came to my mind was the wardrobe. That had to be ours. We'd been writing on it for years, and Mother and Father wouldn't tolerate us writing on someone else's furniture. "Mother, what about the wardrobe?" "What about it, Deza?" "We wrote all over it. It's always been part of our family history." Well, it was part of the Malone history for a while. Ever since I was 2 and Jimmy was almost 5, on each of our birthdays, we would stand next to the open wardrobe door. We'd stretch our necks as long as they'd go, without letting our feet come off the ground. Then Mother and Father would put a ruler on top of our heads and take a pencil and make a mark to show how tall we were. That way we could keep track of how much we'd grown. All that stopped around the time Jimmy turned 12. I was 9 then. After measuring me, Father put the ruler on Jimmy's head. It was right at the same mark it had been the last time. Father looked at Mother, then made a mark that was a half an inch taller than Jimmy really was. I almost said, "Hey, that's not fair," but Mother shot me a look and I kept quiet. Jimmy was so happy that he had grown even that much. But after a while, when my dress had to be let out, Jimmy was wearing the same clothes month after month. We stopped doing the wardrobe on our birthdays. Yes, Deza, we wrote on it because we thought a million years ago that we were going to buy the furniture from the landlord. But just like with so many other things, life got in the way, which is just an unpoetic way of saying gang after Lee. Mother was so sad that I said, "I guess that means we've got a lot less to worry about, right?" She smiled. "When aren't you right, my mighty Miss Malone?" "It's only because I've got the blood of the Malones in my veins. You also have the blood of my family, the Sutphins, in there too. Let's not forget that." We looked around at what we'd need to pack. There wasn't going to be much. Mother said, "Okay, Deza, Mr. Rhymes is going to give us a ride as far as Detroit. I've got $3 for gas for him, then another $2 for a bus fare to Flint. Jimmy, we'll be leaving in 3 days. You've got to say goodbye to your friends. I'd much prefer you write rather than visit in person, those who are currently in jail." Mother could still make jokes. She told me, "Sweetheart, you have permission to walk over to Mrs. Needham's and Clarice's to say goodbye. Jimmy, walk with your sister, please. Give them my love, Deza." This was going to be terrible. I was relieved when no one answered Mrs. Needham's door. She was counting on me so much that I knew it would break her heart that I was leaving, but I stayed strong. It wasn't until we were walking to Clarice's that I could feel tears swelling up in my eyes. How can you say goodbye to the best friend you've ever had? I reached over and took Jimmy's hand. I knew he wouldn't try to pull away. "Come on, sis, don't cry. We got to get this over with. It's just like when you pulled that tape off of my eyebrow. Do it quick. That way it don't hurt as much." Jimmy knocked and Mrs. Johnson answered. "Why, Jimmy, Deza, come in. Children, what's wrong with you?" She pinched my cheek. Jimmy said, "Bad news, Mrs. Johnson. We got to move to Michigan, and Deza's come to say goodbye to Clarice." Oh, dear. She wiped at my tears and said, "I'm so sorry, Deza. Did you forget? Clarice and Mr. Johnson and the big boys found some work with Uncle Boo in Nashville. They left an hour ago." I'd forgotten all about Clarice telling me this. "I'm not expecting him back till next Thursday. Can you come then?" Jimmy said, "No, ma'am. We're leaving on Wednesday." Secretly, this wasn't such bad news. I knew if I saw how Clarice would take me leaving, it would scar and bruise my soul in a way that wouldn't heal for centuries. Jimmy said, "Do you want to write her a note or something, Deza?" I tried to talk, but only sobs came out. I nodded my head. Mrs. Johnson said, "Hold on a minute, darling. I'll get you a pencil and some paper." Jimmy hugged me hard. She came back. "I swear, these children must eat pencils. All I could find were these crayons, Deza." She handed me a old Prince Albert cigar box full of broken, speckled crayons. She also gave me a piece of blue-lined paper. Mrs. Johnson pulled out a chair at the gigantic table where her family ate. I sat down, took the stub of black crayon, and wrote, "My dearest sister Clarice." My hands started shaking too much and my eyes started getting too cloudy to write. For me, to write a letter telling Clarice a proper goodbye would take years. This letter had to be the best memory Clarice could have. I need I needed it to be so special that she'd keep it folded up in her pocketbook for centuries and would show it to her great great grandchildren and tell them, "Once upon a time, in a city named Gary, Indiana, there lived two great and loving friends." My head plopped down on the table. Jimmy put his arms around my shoulders. He took the crayon out of my hand. "You want me to write it for you, sis?" I looked up and shook my head. Jimmy said, "Well, someone's got to write something. What should I say?" I just blubbered. He looked over at Mrs. Johnson. I could see where my dear Clarice got her kind and loving nature. Her mother was close to blubbering too. Jimmy said, "Okay, sis, how about if I draw something for Clarice?" Oh no, not one of Jimmy's drawings. Could fate be any crueler? Not only was I losing my best friend, but Jimmy wanted one of his horrid drawings to be the last thing Clarice heard from me. I had to pull myself together and stop Jimmy from drawing anything, but the heaviness in my heart had swelled up into my head too, and it plopped back down into my arms. Jimmy tugged at the piece of paper I was crying on. "Raise up some, sis. Just give me a minute." He started drawing. There! He gave the paper to Mrs. Johnson. She looked like she wanted to say something kind about it but couldn't find the words. I was going to have to translate. I wiped my eyes and blinked at the piece of paper. It was another very bad drawing. Under where I had written "My dearest Clarice," Jimmy had used the black crayon to draw two frowning girls standing with their arms spread out all the way out to their sides. There was a capital D over the left-hand one. Was supposed to be me. There was a capital C over the girl on the right-hand side. My left arm and Clarice's right were as long as giraffe necks and reached to the center of the page. Each of us held one side of a red dripping blob. Both of us had huge fat drops of water squirting out of our eyes and spraying all over the page. Right in the middle of both my and Clarice's stomachs were two big red-colored end circles. Jimmy'd printed "Deza Steers" by the girls who was supposed to be me. There was one arrow coming from those words that pointed at the water Jimmy had drawn coming out of my eyes, and another arrow and pointed at a half circle near the bottom of the page. Inside the half circle was a spot where the blue lines of the paper had got blurry and looked like a beautiful turquoise puffy cloud floating at the bottom of the page. It was where my real tears had blurred the paper's blue lines. I could see that "Deza Steers" should have been spelled "Deza's Tears." I pointed at the two big red circles on our stomachs. Jimmy said, "It's that corny hand signal you and Clarice give each other about having one heart, and those are two holes where it used to be before it got broken too." What could I do? I hugged my big brother and choked out, "Thank you so much, Jimmy. This is perfect." He smiled. "Yeah, I thought so too. Come on, Deza. We gotta make sure Ma's okay." Which is exactly what you'd expect from the best big brother in the world.